Word. We've been looking at the resurrection of Jesus. This is part 4, the last part. And we saw that the resurrection of Jesus is the belief that he returned to life on Sunday, 3 days after he was crucified. And this is a central tenet of our faith. One of the earliest Christian creeds, the Nicene Creed, part of it says, on the 3rd day he rose again in accordance with the scriptures. Very important. This is what differentiates Christianity from other religions. We don't serve a dead prophet or a dead dictator. We serve someone who is alive. We don't have to go to Mecca to see the tomb of Muhammad. We don't have to go see the tomb of Buddha. When we go to Israel, there's a tomb that's empty. Okay, because when the woman came there, they were told, he is not here. Why do you look for the dead? I mean, the living among the dead. He's not here, he is risen. And so we saw as a result, you attack the resurrection because it's what differentiates Christianity. It's a living faith, not serving someone who's dead. And we saw how there are those who attack the historicity of Jesus, and we addressed all those. We looked at the theory that people tried to say that the body was stolen, which is what the Sadducees started early, and saw the arguments against that. We saw the wrong tomb theory. And then last time we looked at the hallucination theory and the spiritual resurrection theory. So the final one that I want to address is what's called the Swoon Theory. So according to this, they claim that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but that he just fell unconscious, that he swooned. And then after he was put in the damp tomb, bleeding and without food or water for 3 days, he revived. He unwrapped himself from the grave clothes, even though we know with Lazarus, they had to unwrap him. And he managed to roll away the 2-ton stone, and he overpowered the Roman gods and went on to convince others that he had actually risen from the dead. And this hypothesis is actually not even widely held by liberal scholars, because it is probably one of the worst theories that they came up with. Besides this controversial German theologian who first suggested it. And he was a professor at Leipzig, and he was actually dismissed for immoral living. And he eventually even abandoned Christianity, and he went on to attack not only Christianity, but every form of religion. And this is the man who first suggested this theory. Now, if you believe this, and there's certainly not many people that I know who believe it, although you will see that it is held by people who are within Islam, it attributes incompetence to many people. It basically says that the entire squad of Roman executioners, who at the time were the most knowledgeable military men in the world, experts at killing people, they didn't know the difference between someone who was dead or alive. It means that the Roman and the Jewish leaders all failed to discover this deception. And the disciples were stupid enough to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, and all of them actually died for that belief. None of them, renounced their faith in Jesus, and they all went to terrible deaths because they said Jesus has risen from the dead. And so the reality is, if we look at the historical record, and that's what we see in the Gospels, the writers, many of them eyewitnesses, is that Pilate was so thorough, he wouldn't even release the body of Jesus to Joseph. Joseph came and asked for the body of Jesus to bury until the centurion in charge had come to him and verified that Jesus was dead. He wasn't going to let Joseph just take the body. And so Mark 15:43-45, Joseph of Arimathea went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So he wanted to make sure, and the centurion in charge verified that Jesus was, in fact, dead. Now, the main critics of this theory are actually medical experts, and this is what we're going to look at primarily. And so there's quite a number of articles. I've referenced at least 4 by men who are medical doctors, and based on the account that's been given, they criticize this theory. So let's just briefly look at Jesus' medical state at the time of the crucifixion. We find that firstly at the Sanhedrin, we are told that they struck him with their fists, others slapped him, and the guards took him and beat him. So he had been beaten up multiple times. Then we are told that he was flogged. Now, and this is, from God Questions, they say those who were flogged would often go into what is called hypovolemic shock, a term that refers to low blood volume. In other words, the person would have lost so much blood that he would go into shock. Sometimes they even died from the flogging. And this is a medical doctor, Mark Eastman, says scourging was an extreme form of punishment. The flogging Jesus received typically involved a whip with numerous leather thongs, 18 to 24 inches long, with bits of metal, bone, or glass embedded in the leather. At times, they would use an iron rod to beat the prisoner. According to Jewish custom, a prisoner was usually flogged 39 times. The skin on the victim's back was usually shredded, thus exposing the underlying muscle and skeletal structures. Many victims died from such scourging. That was enough to kill many. Then there was further blood loss, because we see that the Roman soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head as well. And again, further medical trauma, because then the Roman soldiers took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. Britannica says that in the case of crucifixion, the condemned man, after being whipped or scourged, dragged the crossbeam of his cross to the place of punishment. And so we are told in John that Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified, and he was carrying his own cross out to the place of the skull, Golgotha, to be crucified. But what subsequently happened is we find from the Synoptic Gospels that Simon of Cyrene was commandeered to carry the cross later. Now, we don't know why, but it's been speculated, and it's probably fair speculation, that Jesus may have collapsed due to exhaustion. He did multiple beatings, blood loss, and he was so weak physically already then that is probably the reason why they grabbed someone from the crowd to carry the cross. Now, when I spoke on the cross last year, I mentioned to you that the Latin word for cross is actually kirux, and we get our word excruciating from that. Intensely painful. If you say something's excruciating, you mean it's not so sore, it's very sore. And that's where the word came from the cross. Now, why was it so painful? Well, the victim was forced to push themselves up on the cross, a distance of about 12 inches, in order to breathe. If you just dropped and let yourself go, you'd die of asphyxiation in minutes. And so in this condition, after being flogged, you'd be still pushing yourself up just to stay alive. The process of respiration caused excruciating pain, mixed with the absolute terror of asphyxiation. Added to this was the dehydration, wound infection, and shock from the blood loss. The dehydration was aggravated by the blood loss as well. And so death ultimately occurred through a combination of constrained blood circulation, organ failure, and asphyxiation as the body strained under its own weight, according to Britannica. Now, when they got to the crucifixion site, they put the crossbeam on the ground, and the victim was laid upon it. And they were stripped of their clothing. They were hung naked, despite the fact that for decency, obviously the artists don't show that. It was for further humiliation. They were hung naked, and they effectively had their hands nailed to the crossbeam through the wrists. And once the crossbar was in place, the feet were nailed to either one side of the upright, or they crossed the feet and put a single nail through it. Now, that is a nail that is actually believed to have been used in a crucifixion. They actually found it, archaeologists in a tomb in Jerusalem, and I won't go into all the details of that, but the speculation is quite rife that that is a typical nail that was used for crucifixion, about 15 centimeters long and 1 centimeter thick. And they think that it was probably hit like that afterwards in order to make sure it didn't come out or the person couldn't pull themselves free. In some cases, nails would be driven through the heel bones, and in other cases, as I said, one nail would go through the metatarsals in the middle of the foot. The points would go into the vicinity of the median nerve, causing shocks of pain to radiate through the arms. You can imagine being impaled in that way with nails. And again, there we have a picture of a nail actually through human bone. So we had some very clever people who ignored all the historical evidence, who tried to say that people weren't actually nailed, they were tied with ropes. According to them, well, they've actually got, since 1968, archaeological evidence of a crucifixion. And there you can see that's actually the remains of a man who appears to have been crucified. And not only that, the New Testament multiple times confirms that Jesus wasn't nailed. He wasn't tied. Here's just one I'll give you. Acts 2, verse 23. Peter says, "This man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." And remember Thomas, the skeptic, who said, "I won't believe he's resurrected unless I see him." He said, "I want to see the nail prints in his hands." They used nails. They didn't tie them with ropes. Dr. Mark Eastman says that with crucifixion, as the strength of the legs gives out, remember you're trying to push yourself up just so you can breathe, the weight of the body must now be borne by the arms and shoulders. The result is that within a few minutes of being placed on the cross, the shoulders will become dislocated. Minutes later, the elbows and the wrists become dislocated. So adding to the pain as well and the medical trauma. And one of the effects was also severe dehydration and thirst because of the loss of the body fluids through perspiration and the open wounds. And we have the account that Jesus on the cross saying, "I thirst." So we know that he was dehydrated. Now, as I've pointed out, people would push themselves up on their legs to prevent suffocation. That's why when they wanted to speed up death, they broke the legs. In case you wondered, how's that going to speed up death? They would break the legs. The person could no longer push themselves up by their legs, and they died within 20 minutes. So if you weren't pushing yourself up with your legs, if your legs had been broken, you would die within 20 minutes. From the accumulation of fluid in the lungs. So, and this is a big problem for the swoon theory, if Jesus swooned on the cross and people thought he was dead, even if he wasn't dead, within 20 minutes he would have been, because he had no support of his legs if he had swooned. You wouldn't think someone had swooned if you saw them pushing themselves up with their legs. So let's just look at the 20 minutes and see if that's feasible. Jesus is reported as having died at about the 9th hour. So he must have at least slipped into unconsciousness. Let's assume he hadn't died, that he had swooned at the 9th hour. Well, subsequent to that, he wasn't brought down from the cross immediately, because we are told that Joseph had to go to Pilate and ask him for the body. But then we see that there was a further delay because Pilate didn't agree. Initially, he summoned the centurion. They had to go fetch the centurion who had to come back and verify that Jesus was dead. And even then, we see that Jesus was not removed immediately, because after that, it says that Joseph first went to buy some linen to act as grave clothes. And we are expected to believe that all that happened in under 20 minutes. It's highly unlikely that that set of events could have been completed in 20 minutes. And Jesus, even if he did swoon, would have been dead in 20 minutes. And so, as I pointed out, they could hasten death by shattering the legs with an iron club, and that prevented them from pushing their body up and not suffocating quickly. And we know, again, from writings from that time, that it was a common practice among the Jews. They often did it when they wanted to get the body down quickly. And in this case, they wanted the bodies down because the next day was religious holiday. But we are told in John 19:32 that the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. The soldiers then come to Jesus, and it says, when they came to him, they found that he was already dead, and they did not break his legs. So these soldiers, who were thorough enough to break the legs of the others, were so convinced that Jesus was dead that they didn't break his legs. However, what they did do, and maybe it was just to make double sure, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear. And we are told that it brought a sudden flow of blood and water. So you might be wondering, why blood and water? Blood obviously makes sense. So again, let me quote Dr. C. Truman Davis, a medical doctor. He says, apparently to make sure of death, the legionnaire drove his lance through the fifth interspace between the ribs, upward through the pericardium, that's a sac around the heart, and into the heart. There was an escape of watery fluid because this pericardium contains water. It cushions the heart when it's pumping. And that's one of the most common explanations for the blood and the water, is that the pericardium had ruptured, which also indicates death, by the way. There was an escape of watery fluid from the sac surrounding the heart and the blood from the interior of the heart. We therefore have rather conclusive post-mortem evidence that our Lord died, not the usual crucifixion death by suffocation, but of heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. That's in medical terms. I explained it to you in layman's terms, okay? Right. And so, again, I just want to read this to you as well, more details on that. There apparently are other possible sources for the water that doctors have suggested. The water can only have been from the lungs or the pericardium. Thus, the spear thrust was a deep one. As Jesus was lifted up on a cross at the time, this thrust must have come from below. Remember, they were hung, fairly high, as well as to the side. Because of this, it would have to pass through the diaphragm to reach the lungs. So this is assuming he had pierced the lungs. And through either the spleen or the liver. This would have been enough to ensure the death of Jesus, even if he had been in full health. If the spear pierced the pericardium, then this would have also killed Jesus. So the two explanations, either into the lungs or into the heart, both of them would have killed him even if he was in perfect health, which we've seen he wasn't. And they go on to say, incidentally, both the spleen and the liver bleed after death. I mentioned hypovolemic shock earlier on. And so, just to tell you a bit more about that, with the blood loss from the flogging and the further loss from the stab wound that he'd now got, Jesus would have gone into hypovolemic shock, which is, again, a medical term speaking about shock that people go into when they've got extreme low blood pressure due to bleeding. Without a transfusion and with nothing to stop the internal hemorrhaging, he would have died within minutes. Prior to the stab wound, the blood loss alone would have killed him in a few hours. Yet we expected to believe that he was put in a tomb and survived 3 days without food and water in that state. With the internal bleeding and buildup of fluids, Jesus would have died from congestive heart failure. Pathologists generally agree that this was a contributing cause of Jesus' death. And as I say, I'm citing medical experts. This is not Gavin Painter speculating here. This is medical doctors. So let's just look at that. Supposing Jesus didn't die of asphyxiation or of congestive heart failure or of hypovolemic shock because of all the blood loss, or from the internal hemorrhaging itself, which is evident from what came out when they pierced him. They go on to say, even if he didn't die of all of that, he now had a large, deep, open chest wound through at least one lung and probably the heart with internal bleeding. And that alone would have caused internal infection, they're saying. In a few days, he would have died of sepsis infection. I don't think that the Romans necessarily had very clean spears. And so, reading in John 19, 38 to 40, later Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. With Pilate's permission, that's after all the stuff we read in between, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped. Now, bear in mind, this is how they embalmed them. 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. That's a significant amount. They wrapped them in these cloths, and you have 75 pounds of spices holding this thing together. And that was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. And so we have Jesus placed in the tomb after suffering all that we've read, from the eyewitness accounts. And now we are told that he is wrapped in grave clothes and is 75 pounds of spices. So the other problem is, assuming he was still alive amazingly, contrary to all the evidence, and opinions of medical doctors, how would he get out of the wrappings, around his body with 75 pounds of spice without someone helping him? We find, remember when Lazarus was raised from the dead, Jesus had to tell other people to unbound him. And in fact, again, the eyewitnesses tell us that the linen wrappings appeared to be undisturbed. That's one of the things that John says, that when he saw that, he said he believed. He hadn't even seen Jesus yet. They saw linen cloths that had been undisturbed, as if Jesus' body, I believe, had passed straight through them. Why would he look at linen cloth and believe? Unless he saw evidence of them not being unwrapped and Jesus' body passing straight through them. John 20, verse 7 to 8, Peter and John have come to the tomb now because Mary has told them it's empty. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed based on what he saw. And so, as I say, we can only speculate what he saw with those linen cloths, but something led him already then to believe that Jesus had risen. And so, if we go back to our swoon theory, Jesus has to remain immobile from the Thursday evening to early Sunday morning, and then he wakes up and feels a bit better. And he manages, after he's unwrapped himself from, all the embalming, to, roll away a 2-ton stone. And then he faces 4 soldiers who he overpowers. And he tackles this guard of the most efficient soldiers in the ancient world that conquered the known world. And yet they seemed defenseless, 4 of them with weapons, against someone who was in such a poor medical state and who had just pushed away a 2-ton stone. Well, you need more faith to believe that than to believe that someone rose from the dead. And then he tops it all on his feet, which have been pierced with those nails that are, remember, over a foot long and 1 centimeter thick. 3 days later, he walks from Jerusalem to Emmaus. 12.1 kilometers on feet that had that done to them as well. And then he manages, this half-dead Jesus, to convince these 2 disciples that he's actually raised from the dead and that he's a conqueror over death. Now, David Strauss, pictured over there, was a 19th century liberal theologian. He wasn't a conservative. He scandalized Christian Europe because He wrote works about the historical Jesus, and he denied that Jesus was divine, denied, that he was the Son of God. And yet even he thought that the swoon theory was totally impossible. And he considered it unlikely that Jesus could inspire faith in people after barely surviving a crucifixion. And this is what he wrote, this skeptic. He said it is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry, an impression that caused them, as I say, to be willing to the man to die for Jesus, to be crucified, stoned, and pierced with spears and all the other cruel ways that the disciples were killed, because they were so convinced that he was a conqueror over death. And so Strauss asserted that even if the swoon theory was conceivable, it could still not account for the disciples' belief in the risen Jesus. Since they did proclaim him to be resurrected and glorified Lord, the swoon theory is not able to account for the facts. And after Strauss wrote his work, that theory died a death even among liberals. And that's why even today you won't find liberal theologians who hold to it. And because of Strauss himself was a liberal who just said that the theory was ludicrous. By the early 20th century, other critical scholars proclaimed this theory to be nothing more than a historical curiosity of the past. Yet, we had in South Africa a Muslim, Ahmad Didat, who was very anti-Christian, and he went around claiming that Jesus did not die upon the cross, but survived the crucifixion. So he borrowed from the swoon theory. But strangely, he used an argument that's not even held by mainstream Muslims, because it comes from what's called the Ahmadiyya sect, and they regard it as heretical by mainstream Muslims. And there's the man who founded the movement. He proposed a theory in his 1899 book called Jesus in India, where he claimed that Jesus survived the cross and then went to India. And he said that Jesus had died in Kashmir. And then he further went on to say that he was the Imam, the second Messiah, the Mahdi. So we know that the Muslims are looking for the second Messiah, the Mahdi. And he claimed that he was the guy, and that Jesus was actually buried in India. And there we have the shrine, because the problem is if Jesus survived, well, where is his body? We know the tomb in Israel is empty. And so they claimed that this was the shrine where Jesus was buried in Kashmir. But we know again from experts that this tomb that they show is not nearly old enough to be genuine. And so the Ahmadiyyas, the sect, identify the holy man, use Asaf, who's buried there. They say that he was Jesus, and they base this on an account in the history, of Kashmir by some poet. It said that there was a prophet that was buried there who was a foreign prince. And so based on those two things, even though the tomb's not old enough, they say, well, that must have been Jesus who died in India, according to them. Professor Paul Papas, who's a professor of history at West Virginia Institute of Technology, states that from a historical perspective, the Ahmadi identification of this man with Jesus relies on legends and documents which include clear historical errors. He even shows that the reign of this particular king the dates are totally wrong. And he said that it's almost impossible as historian to identify you as Asaf with Jesus. And so I won't read you all of this because I need to wrap up soon, but that particular theory has come under attack by people who are students of history, showing that what they're basing on it is just legend and it's not even historical fact. And that they actually even confused Kashmir with another place, Kushinara, which was the place of Buddha's death. That's the garden tomb in Jerusalem where we believe the body was placed. That's me in 2012, in case you didn't know. All of us who went had our pictures taken there. And so we believe that that's the tomb, the garden tomb where Jesus' body was laid. But if you go inside that tomb, the tomb is empty. No one was put there. There's no bones, no remnants. There was another twist on the swoon theory. A guy called Michael Bagent, with a couple of other buddies of his, wrote a book in 1982, which they call Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And in this book, they speculated that Pontius Pilate was bribed to allow Jesus to be taken down from the cross before he was dead. So they use the same theory, but that's their twist on it. But that's, again, speculation. It ignores all the historical evidence, all the eyewitness evidence. So that's just to say, well, everybody who wrote about it, who was an eyewitness, who was talking rubbish, you can never get away with that in court, saying that all the eyewitnesses are wrong, but I've got a theory and my theory is correct. But this is the kind of guesswork that people come up with who refuse to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So as we draw to a close, there are multiple problems with the swoon theory. It's probably one of the worst of the theories. The medical state of Jesus. The nature of death by asphyxiation on the cross. Remember, hang on the cross when you look like you're dead, 20 minutes you are dead. The medical study of Jesus' chest wound, which we saw could have killed him just alone. Getting Jesus out of the embalming clothes. Moving the 2-ton tombstone. Getting past the guard. And the disciples' response on seeing Jesus. They didn't see someone who was half dead. They saw someone who they were convinced was a victorious, risen Savior. And then, finally, the whereabouts of Jesus' body or tomb. If he didn't die, well, then where are his remains? They're not in Kashmir, we know that. And this thesis also can't account for the conversions of James, Jesus' brother. Remember, James didn't even believe in Jesus. He wasn't one of his disciples. He was a skeptic. And yet, we are told that Jesus appeared to him and he became a leader of the church who wrote a book in the Bible. Not only that, he was martyred. We know from Josephus that he was eventually thrown off the temple and killed. And the conversion of Paul. Paul was not friendly to Christianity. He killed Christians, and yet he sees the risen Jesus on the way to Damascus. And this man who hates Christians turns around to be a person who not only eventually is beheaded because he's a Christian by Nero, but he writes a large portion of our New Testament. You cannot explain those away with this theory. And so just in terms of the historicity of the resurrection, B.F. Westcott, pictured over here, who was an English scholar and theologian, said, raking all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. Nothing but the antecedent assumption that it must be false could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. In other words, he said the only way you can believe it's false is if you have a predisposition to want to believe it. Professor Thomas Arnold, who was a professor at Oxford in the 19th century, said, I have been used for many years to study the histories of other times and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who've written about them. And I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God hath given, that Christ died and rose again from the dead. Just read you a few more. E.M. Blaurock, a professor of classics at Auckland University in the 20th century, says, I claim to be a historian. My approach to classics is historical, and I tell you that the evidence for the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history that people accept without question. And then we need to remember as well that the initial message of the resurrection wasn't preached in a remote area. They preached it in the very town where Jesus, or the city where he was crucified. So that's where the story could have easily been refuted or verified. And yet in the very town that he was crucified, no one could produce a body and no one could refute that Jesus had risen from the dead. And yet we find, despite that, that the church grew rapidly. 5,000 people converted on one occasion, 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. We told how the church grew rapidly in this very place where Jesus was crucified because of eyewitnesses going around saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so I'll just skip forward to this. Josh McDowell, very well known today, but he was a former skeptic, didn't believe in Christ, didn't believe in the resurrection. And in fact, he actually started researching. He wanted to write a book to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. And this is what he says. Everything that Jesus Christ taught, lived, and died for was based on the resurrection. All I had to do was prove that it never took place. But that too backfired on me, and in fact led to my writing The Resurrection Factor because of the evidence. Very good book if you want to read it. So this man who actually is trying to write the book to disprove the resurrection becomes a Christian when he examines the evidence honestly. And so in conclusion, our hope of our own resurrection and life everlasting is based on Jesus' resurrection. If Jesus wasn't raised, Paul says your faith is in vain. Because we believe that Jesus said, there will come a day when all who are dead will hear the voice of the Son of God and be resurrected. And if Jesus isn't alive, that's not possible. But we see that our hope of our own resurrection is based on something that's not wishful thinking, but on a historic fact, something that could be proved in a court of law. Remember, there were over 500 witnesses on one case who saw him. Imagine going to court and having 500 eyewitnesses. I think you'd have a good case. And so Romans 1 verse 4 says that Jesus, who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. 1 Peter 1 verse 3 says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope. So we're not following a dead prophet. We have a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And so we're going to be closing with a song. And as I pointed out when I first spoke, if you were wanting directions in the street, how to get to the railway station, and you see two people, one person's alive, another person's dead, who you're going to ask for directions. I think you're going to get better directions from the person who's alive.